and thank you for that short introduction. I mostly like to think of myself as a very dynamic person. Of course, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've been a coach for quite some time now. Always done my own business, going from company to company, helping with transformation, as the case may be, digital or software or just any form of transformation that you might just think of that is there. Of course, business-oriented transformation as much as possible. So leadership has been my own, key interest for the most part. Part of this is that apart from, having leadership as my major from school, is an interesting topic, because every time you look around within organizations, things either go south or north or west or east. And people fail to understand that, well, it's probably happening this way because there's some very fundamental things that is not really happening within the organization. We miss that point a lot of times. I'm trying to get to my screen here because ideally so far, I have to apologize. My system here, I haven't really used, I have a completely new system. I haven't really used it with different screens for presentation. This is the first time. And I just realized that I had some errors as far as connecting to extended screens. And so I lost completely my access to the right speaker form that I should use. But I don't want to spend so much time there. I'm just going to go straight to the slide and do the best that I can, to get us through this topic. So that said, I'm going to try to steal the screen from you.
Yeah, you can go ahead. You can share. I stopped sharing.
Right. Let me see. It's so hard trying to do that on one little screen. Okay. Right. There we go.
There we go.
Yep.
Yeah, you have to maximize your.
Right. I'm going to take this away, but run around and do my presentation mode.
Okay.
All right. Full screen mode. All right. I have to get this out of the way as much as possible. All right. So that's my topic. Cynthia is a coach. I said again, for those that just joined, I see people are still joining. I've worked with several organizations, and I thank you for joining, Brooke. Thank you for joining. Donna is from, I met Donna at Monsanto, also one of my clients. I've worked with companies in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, insurance, and so on. So it's a good experience, and it's been a good journey, and all points back to leadership. So, the point is, why does leadership command so much attention is an interesting topic that I chose, to speak about. I've also done this presentation in other forums, like, City University of New York. I've done this also at Bayer Crop Science. I've done this with some of the clients that I've had, several times. It always goes down to the same thing. People become so curious. In one of the situations, I did present this topic, and an interesting metrics, happened after the presentation. We had also a leadership video played by Simon Sinek. And it turns out, for some reason, 0 was the difference, but a good 0 in this index. As a fact, 17 views on Simon Sinek's leadership topic, 170 views on this same leadership topic. So 0 made a difference in this instance. So why leadership commands so much attention is just a question that I like to ask, and maybe it will take us back to the fundamentals of everything within the organization. As we know it, it's like gardening. You want to plant anything in your garden, you have to make sure you have the right soil that is fertile enough for everything else to grow. So that to us, is leadership. If you look at it from the House of Lead perspective, it also shows you that leadership is a very fundamental element, that will help your organization propagate well in any circumstance. And I call that, maybe supplementary in some cases. But at the same time, let's take it from the table of content perspective. We will probably look at the problems associated with maybe the leadership or the lack thereof, and then we'll go through the meaning of leadership and probably some assumptions as we would have it. And then we'll also look at the still perspective of leadership, which I have summarized everything just to make it very easy. And I'm saying easy, from the sense that I did have this conversation. The original perspective came from conversations with doctoral students from the Copenhagen University. And we tried to make it very academic in content, but that did not fly well with so many other audiences that we had to present to. So we tried to bring it back, to a general audience kind of context, prime content for general audience. And then, it's been diluted in some form, but that's not to say it's lost its value altogether. And then after that, we will look at, after the distilled leadership perspective, we will look at the values typology. Values typology really comes from organizational behavior. And then also we'll take you to the motivationally distinct values type, what we call the values wheel. And we'll breeze through that quickly and then take you to the application of leadership that will help you determine whether you want to make a left turn or you want to make a right turn when you think of leadership. And also the modeling of what we would kind of recommend, for organizations to follow. And you also see that this is real. There's some theoretical aspects to this. But at the same time, theory is always from practice. So I will also show you the practical aspects of leadership that is working in real organizations today, at least within the United States as well. So that said, the overview of this is most organizations have visions and they have roadmaps, they have goals. For example, being the solution of choice is one of those things that you hear within product line organizations or service-oriented organizations, and also maybe being like the investment of choice, along the road, somewhere down there. One thing they don't talk a lot about is the factor of continuous commitment, which is actually an organizational behavior term, to describe how people log within the organization because they're dissatisfied, they're unhappy with the trend of things, what they're hearing, where the organization is going, and how they feel. But they just quietly sit there and wait for the right economic opportunity for them to move on. And you will see some examples of this. And then what happens is, after continuous commitment, of course, the organization might not be able to achieve that goal of 2026 to be employer of choice, because this is an impact significantly a lot of times on employees. So when that falls, that goes south, innovation will probably also be affected within the organization. So the yellow line here, continuous commitment, is a factor of leadership that people don't talk about a lot. And I will show you some very good examples. And, without mentioning names, I always respect my clients. So we can talk somewhat about that. The overview of leadership here is really about what we understand, how we been able to define what leadership is. So as you would find here, about 700, let's just say 724 million leadership queries were on Google. This is prior to, ChatGPT or bad Google. There's been a lot of queries run in Google systems, which is the de facto source of, search queries. Online queries is probably the highest. And also the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress, as you might know, is one of those congressional libraries for legislative processes. Also provides materials for syndicated researchers to, look into statistics or look into prime content that will help them, not just within legislative processes, but also generally in all kinds of subjects. And leadership there, you will find that it's not just within an organization, let's say, that is maybe medical industry. You have leadership in all sorts of forms and shapes, even criminal justice. You have leadership in soccer, anything sports, athletes, they talk about leadership. Schools, everyone talks about leadership. So this is a consolidation of queries that have come from our investigation on the topic called leadership from different sources, not just within, because we talk about the Library of Congress, not just from the political sector, but everywhere else. So what you will find in that the graph that I have there, leadership materials, will probably sum up to about 5,525 additional leadership materials within the Library of Congress. That probably has about 55, 54 or 55 million thereabout articles, and so on and so forth. So within a set period, you can see like, an interval of like every 10 years, from 1980 to 1989, about 1,711, leadership materials were added to the Library of Congress. So between 1990 and 1999, about 3,054 leadership materials were added to the, this includes everything, newspapers, articles and so on. So 7,336 was added between the years of 2000 and up to 2009. Materials were added, all on leadership. So that's it. It takes you to what has been defined. Let's start with the Harvard Business Review, for example, which of course is a prime content, highly peer-reviewed material from the Harvard University College itself. They answer the question that is mostly asked, like, is leadership management? Why is leadership not the same thing as management? So Harvard Business Review tells us that, well, leadership is not the same thing as management. Management is a different thing entirely, and leadership is a different thing entirely. And some people ask the question, well, is leadership the same thing as a position? Well, Tony Robbins answered that question already. So while people always think, and this is very magical, it's like the more you talk about leadership as a factor of something else, and I don't have to say it now, people always immediately revert to leadership as a position. And that reminds me, Nelu, I think we had an activity that we wanted to request maybe the participants here to try their hands on that survey, quick survey. If it's something you can launch, please let me know if we can launch that questionnaire and see if people will respond to it and how many people can respond to it. Is that something we can do?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, guys.
Right.
Share my screen, and I'm going to send this link via the chat. And the first thing we want to ask you is, what is leadership in one word? So this is very easy to use. You can click on the link on the chat, and then you can go ahead and put one word that for you describes what leadership is. Or
Thank you.
There you go. Or you can also use this QR code to actually join in as well. So let's give it a couple of minutes, seconds actually. 1 sec.
Okay.
There we go. All right. Influencer example. There we go.
So Nelu, are we going to see the responses here, like real time?
Yeah, we are. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Hold on.
Okay, I think something is coming. Understand.
Yeah.
Service.
So we have info. So what is leadership in one word? And then we have guidance from Felicia.
Okay.
Guidance. So we have influencer, example, understanding, service, and we have guidance on the chat.
Okay.
All right. I don't know if we want to use the other poll right now, or just maybe later you let me know, Ascension.
Okay, yeah, we can stay with this one for now.
Great. So there we go.
All right, thank you.
There you go. And then someone said boss.
Boss.
Boss. Like
that's an interesting one.
Boss. There you go. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So let me take the screen back and I go back here this time around. All right. So leadership, according to Harvard Business Review, is not the same thing as management. And leadership is not a position, according to Tony Robbins, who is a motivational speaker that some of us probably would have heard of. And then one way or the other, you would also understand that leadership probably has two definitions, and in this context, but it's also a lot of times conceived or used or applied as a noun, and maybe also used as an adjective in some cases. So when we think of it as a noun, I think is what influences people's thoughts or determines the application of leadership as it relates to position. As an adjective, of course, we know adjectives are just actions. So it's more like, do we think of leadership in terms of our actions, our activities, what we do? Or do we think of leadership as a position? As most times when we see leadership, we say, well, senior manager is a leader. Then we have a VP is a leader, stuff like that. But from now onwards, you probably will realize that leadership is not really a position, even though it tends to apply in some cases as a position. But that's not how we see it. So, and I can take you to the real meaning of leadership here. If you did that, brief exercise, you will probably understand that a consensus reached by, 54 leadership experts, from 38 countries, probably more, agreed that leadership is really that one word that they prefer is probably motivation. It's about motivating people and enabling others to contribute towards the effectiveness and success of the organization of which they are members of. So that's how leadership has been defined, for the most part. And some say, well, we don't really agree with that. Well, what do you agree with? The fact is that, people need to be motivated. A lot of times, there's also been like surveys and studies that happen in countries like Israel, very suburban study done by what they call SWOT theories, group of syndicated researchers. And they say, well, at the end of the day, what we found is that people want to be motivated. And that motivation does not necessarily come from a few people within the organization. Motivation should come from several people within the organization, not just by people, acclaimed managers, for example, or people that we feel are rightly positioned within the organization in terms of the hierarchy, to enable or to influence, others to perform. But leadership could be defined in several other regards. And then it could also take you to why we tend to misuse leadership, because we, by default, think of it as, well, it's a subject matter of positional advantage. It's a subject matter of people in hierarchy, in higher places within the organization. And this is not just within, today's search engines that we always, refer to as a library for content references, but you can equally look at real text that provide real academic content as well as organizational behavior content. Because I use the word organizational behavior because leadership is really a subject matter of organizational behavior. And organizational behavior is actually a key principle to understanding the psychological mechanism within the organization. So in transformation, when we think of it, sometimes we, have a blind spot, or sometimes we keep our tunnel vision on certain things, like people refer to the cliche-wise as tactical approach to implementing change or transformation within the organization, without taking that robust, holistic look at what transformation should look like. And, in terms of what we call transformation gravity, which is the point where you have to understand the pull and push or imbalance within the organization for you in order for you to pivot from that to help the organization go in the right direction as far as transformation. So this also takes you back why leadership is misused. We can see 5 good reasons. Of course, there's several reasons, but I did constrict and reduce this to about 5 reasons that would just make sense to us. At the end of this conversation, we can say, well, how do we solve this? Well, lack of education stood out as the primary reason, and most times we feel that, lack of education is really inadequate education or training on the meaning of leadership is what we see as the primary reason for people misusing leadership, or in some cases, abusing leadership as a term. So the implication is that, being a leader, the practice of effective leadership is number one. For most people, they think that the practice of effective leadership is really from the top than from anywhere else that we will discover here. And so then the other one is misuse of power. Misuse of power sounds like intentional, but in some cases might be unintentional or subconscious, because people use this word, to justify their abuse that they seek to control power over people or have control over resources. And I use resources, differently because people are not resources, and they look for ways to exercise authority within the organization. And at some point, we will begin to see the relationship of these in terms of the abuse of values, motivational values, I call them, and how they relate to organizational values itself. So let's go through that a little bit more. So the third reason here is narrow focus on individual achievement. All these 2 factors, 2 and 3, I started talking about motivational values because, power and achievement you will find within the values wheel as a context of motivational value that relates to organizational value. So in terms of basic individual motivational values as they relate to organizational value types. So narrow focus on individual achievement is the other reason that we find a lot of times that leads to the misuse or abuse of leadership as a term. So failure to recognize diverse styles of leadership. And so if you ask me, well, what are those diverse styles of leadership? There's several of them. You have different kinds of leadership, which you will find in what I call the distilled perspective of leadership. I don't want to, go ahead of myself here. But the fact is that if people fail to recognize diverse styles of leadership, what I would recommend for you to do is to train them on distilled forms of leadership. Misuse of power, there's also a recommendation for that. You can train them on, other aspects of leadership that will help them understand that, misuse of power is really about understanding what we call the contingencies of power. And this is also from organizational behavior, because within the context of power within organizations, you will find that there are things called contingencies of power that relate to power, that sometimes people approach the contingencies and they seek power without really realizing that they are seeking power. For example, networking is one of those contingencies, visibility. And we hear that a lot of times in organizations, and people say, well, we're seeking to make our demo, visible within the organization. What they are seeking to do is they're actually seeking power one way or the other, and you don't even realize it. The other contingency of power is centrality. Being central to most conversations actually gives you power within the organization. And people use leadership, to attain centrality within organizations, and then, without actually, realizing that they are aspiring for a lot of power within the organization, and people, maybe they do. So the fifth one is over-reliance on titles and positions. And this to me is very critical, because it sounds like Every time you look around, someone has an idea, for example, and has to promote that idea within the organization, maybe it's innovative or not, and then they feel like, well, go talk to someone above you, go speak with your manager, let your manager bring forward the idea before we look at it. Maybe it might require funding or not. But the fact is that some of the best ideas come from people who are not in higher positions as such. But we fail to realize that, we fail to recognize that others within the organization can actually bring forward ideas that can move the company forward. I've seen real life in some organizations where the company has suffered a lot of losses, financially over time. And it's very difficult for them. It's been very difficult for them to trace the root causes of these problems that leads to huge losses in their financial returns. But at the end of the day, some of the critical solutions came from real people that were frontline workers, we call them. Not so much about, not to say that the executives don't know how to find this thing out, but they're not probably closer to the problems like the frontline workers. So over-reliance on titles and positions takes away the ability of the organization to explore, several opportunities to resolve its own problems, considering the magnitude, the number of people. People are infinite resources, infinite assets within the organization. So the less utility of that value of those assets you have, the less you utilize the value of the organization. So people are really the muscle of your organization. So over reliance on titles and positions tend to take that away. Okay, so earlier on we spoke about the distilled leadership perspective, right? So this is what they are, and in form of real concept of leadership. Not because it's called distilled leadership perspective does not mean that it's diluted. The fact is that it has been summarized in academic context. It's not been diluted in terms of framework or anything else. I'm not disregarding the value of what we have from several agile frameworks and other kinds of frameworks, lean frameworks. That's fine, but this is the core of leadership perspectives as it's provided by the real academic enthusiasts, people that are proponents of leadership from the academic world. So well, one of those things that we see today within organizations would definitely reflect one of these perspectives of leadership. Is it that competency, behavioral perspective of leadership, contingency kind of leadership, transformational? And you will find that transformational is probably one of the most popular kinds of leadership that we have. The implicit kind of leadership as well. So competency is a broad one as well that represents, some of the big five personalities, like you call it today. Some people do some of those tests here and there. Also represents, the keywords that I've listed out here, like conscientiousness, cognitive functions, emotional intelligence is one big one. So when you hear emotional intelligence, you can easily relate after this subject that relates to competency perspective of leadership. Same thing as problem solving. They all roll up to competency style of leadership. Cognitive function, consciousness, they all roll up to competency style of leadership, okay? All right, so the other one that is very popular is behavioral. So behavioral perspective of leadership will, tell you a little bit about, task-oriented leaders, task-oriented managers, or people-oriented managers, or people-oriented leaders, as you might have it. So people-oriented leadership, if you cascade down, it takes you to, servant leadership, which is a big one, for us coaches, especially. We like to talk about servant leadership a lot without really understanding the details of that, which is the devil in it. So the idea is that natural desire is one of those things that you should find in servant leaders. Servant leaders are people that have the calling. And I think that's why it said that, leaders are born, not made, because you should actually have the natural desire to lead in order for you to see yourself as a servant leader, because, servant leadership is not just an easy thing. So you should also be able to anchor ethical practices and principles and not be diverted from that. So sensitivity to enactment of morals also you have to be able to live out, those values as a servant leader yourself. And you should also be able to help people, beyond your basic objectives within the organization. Go beyond, above and beyond, like they say, in order for you to really reflect yourself or your behavior as a servant leader. You have to go beyond company objectives. You have to build good relationships. That cannot be overemphasized. Good relationships. I learned a lot about that from NASA Boulevard. Program managers told us, well, the first thing that got us through some of our projects here, vertical takeoff, vertical landing project, was really about building good relationships with sponsors, key stakeholders, project stakeholders, all sort of stakeholders that we had, investors and so on. So it's really critical, to have people, to have that good relationship with anyone that you have to deal with, anyone within the organization or outside the organization. They could be critical to several things that will help the organization succeed. So servant leadership is huge, as you will find it today, what I'm sharing with you. And people have not talked about it a lot, at this level, in terms of the kind of detail, what that really means. And then humble. I don't know that we can say more about this one. Humility is one great factor that we find as challenging in several organizations. I've asked the questions, how many of us here, managers, senior managers, will be humble enough to sit down in a room for an unqualified coach like me to train you? How many of you will sit in the room? Well, we can't sit in the room. It's a waste of time. We already know that. So, but you need to be humble, because there are certain things that, because coaching, like if you read the book, laser focus coaching, I think coaching is really to help experts within the organization to see things that they probably wouldn't even think of. And we have the ability to do that a lot of times. We might not have the ability to tell you, what the solution will be, because we don't know what you know, and we shouldn't know what you know. But the fact is that we can challenge your thoughts and provoke you, your thinking for you to navigate other sources that you probably wouldn't have thought of. That's what coaches are for. But a lot of times, people within the organizations will tell you, well, we don't want to listen to coaching. We don't want any, ordinary scrum master to try to coach us on certain things, what value is or what focus is and stuff like that. So you have to be humble. It doesn't matter who you are. Egalitarianism is another big one. And then you should not be motivated by power. If you want to see yourself as a servant leader, I've heard people actually, scrum masters and coaches say, well, what do we do? We have no ability to influence people. We need some, level of power in order for us to influence people. Well, you have it already. Your power is humility. Your power is reverence. So the idea of having authority is not what factors into people's leadership, people-oriented leadership or servant leadership. You need zero of that. So it continues to be a topic, but we need to understand these basic things, how they roll up. These are basic traits of servant leadership that rolls you up into behavioral aspect that is expected of you to help influence the organization in this same direction. Okay. So the other ones that I've brought together, and I didn't have to go so much into it, is we have, the contingency perspective of leadership here. And you will find that, well, contingency perspective of leadership is just based on the idea that, maybe the most appropriate leadership style depends on the situation. It's very, very situational. And then the other one that we find here is transformational perspective of leadership, which is a big one. It's, in fact, is by far the most popular perspective of leadership today. They believe that they are seen as the agents of change. Transformational leaders are seen as the agents of change, of creating and communicating and modeling, shared vision within the organization and teams and so on and so forth. So unlike the contingency perspective of leadership, you will find that transformational leaders, tend to mimic that behavior, that they examine how leaders improve employee performance, for example. So I'm here to improve employee performance. So according to the authors of this, and I call them McShane and von Glino, they say, well, there's a caveat to this. The problem is that transformational leadership could easily be expressed as maybe transactional. And transactional, a lot of times, is not what we really want to have, right, in organizations, using rewards to influence people. And, surprisingly, and maybe not too surprisingly, we found that very intelligent people in organizations default immediately by, go down to that pit of saying, well, motivate people with this, motivate people with a little bit of reward, a little bit of, reward points, a little bit of money here, bonuses here, and they will perform well. Well, when you take away, that is conditional, that's transactional. If you take away those rewards, those people won't perform. So how does this relate to the organizational values? It relates to organizational values in two ways. Before we go into that, implicit perspective itself, which is a different form of leadership perspective that talks about mostly prototyping of effective leaders, as well as it constitutes theories, really, of the fact that everyone has preconceived beliefs, for example, about effective leadership, or the other aspect of implicit leadership is what they call romance of leadership, actually. So it exists because in most cultures, and it's kind of sensitive, that most cultures, people want to believe that leaders make a difference, that they influence the environment. And I'm saying it's somewhat sensitive because within the United States, for example, or the Western cultures, there's a general belief that events are generated more from people than from uncontrollable forces of nature. While in some other cultures, cultures, people will say, well, that's not true. There are uncontrollable, force majeure, within the environment that actually determines, things that happen. So leaders are given credit a lot of times, or blamed for company success, and so on. So where we are going with this is there's a term in organizational behavior that is called fundamental attribution error. It's just an error of perception, really, how people think of things without really considering the effect on others. So we don't make those kind of mistakes. We try to avoid them. But how all this relates to our organization, you will see in what I call the values wheel here, the sectors of this circle that speaks to some of us and how we behave. We can go from, go clockwise from power, for example. Now, power is one of those, very prominent motivational, basic individual motivational values type that you have in organizations. So the studies that I referred to is what was done by someone called Schwartz. They call it Schwartz theory. And this was done in a suburban community in Israel. And the result was simple. It took us to the point that, to the understanding that most people seek to contribute to the value of the organization. But because of several other basic individual motivations, several contributors are unable to do so. So what does that take you? It takes you back to where we started. The roadmap of 2025, for example, continuous commitment. So when people are unable to contribute to the values of the organization, the delivery of values of the organization, what they do, they sit back quietly and wait for the opportunity for them to move on, in order for them to look for another organization where they can actually find ways to contribute to the delivery of value within the organization. So that's how organizations fall apart. That's how organizations get deformed. So the way I put it is that organizations have a life cycle. They start by formation, and they go to deformation, and then they look for transformation. So before you get to transformation, your organization would have been deformed. And this also is one of the things that I have in my publication that is almost ready. And I call it form to agility before speed. a lot of times in organizations, we hear about, well, we need to accelerate speed to market. Speed to which market? When you are unable to be agile because you are unable to maintain form. If you are a physical fitness enthusiast like me, you understand that form is everything. There is no way you can build up speed without form if you're an athlete. So how is form translated or transitioned to deformation? Is because of these motivational values. So power is one of them. If you look at it, several people seek power. Power is also defined as authority. They say there's three major kinds of people that we can hardly advise in the world. And those are, people with power, people with wealth, people with, three people: authority, wealth, and power. And then the other one is achievement. Achievement is also what we have on the outer circles here is what you will call higher order motivational types. So you have like self-enhancement. You also have like openness to change. These are higher order motivations, as well as conservation and so on. So they relate to one another. So self-enhancement is a relationship, a combination of achievement and power. And then, openness to change is a combination of stimulation, hedonism, self-direction, and then you can see self-transcendence, which is where most people want to be. Universalism, benevolence is a key factor of those. So then you have conformity and tradition. These are people with status quo. A lot of status quo, factors come from people within these values wheel. Conformity, security. They want to hold on to the job. They want to make the money. That's what takes them to work. So that relates to other kinds of organizational values. You have intrinsic value, extrinsic value, you have social value, you have prestige value. So people within this circle will probably think a lot about prestige value. Then you have intrinsic value, which could be, driven by people within this sector. And then you have extrinsic value, which are people motivated by, job security, money, conformation to tradition, and stuff like that. And this might somewhat be, intrinsic value and social value. So this is how we read values type. This is a very short time. And I do apologize because this is kind of here and there for me. My screens did not give me the best response that I wanted. All right. So how are we doing with time? Nelu?
We're doing good, sir. We still have a good 15 minutes at least. 15 to 20.
All right. Thank you so much. So I would like us, to take us through, the thinking of this nice gentleman, late John W. Gardner. I think he was a former U.S. Secretary for Health, Education, and so on. So he is the one that came up with the saying that the vitality of large organizations is really, depends on the shared leadership. So when you think of it, shared leadership is where we want to go, for the most part. And sometimes we don't have it. But John W. Gardner said, well, in organizations today, we should aspire more for shared leadership, because that is what drives the value within the organization. Is the auxiliary ability of the organizations to perform. So by having shared leadership, John W. Gardner said, well, by having shared leadership, most employees within the organization, all across the organization, all levels of the organization should be able to, seek out opportunities and be able to find solutions to problems within the organization, rather than rely on maybe a few set of, quote unquote leaders or managers to help, maybe resolve risks when they have conflict within the organization. That a real team is one that actually, is self-replenishing. They're able to resolve their own issues, when those conflicts arise, and so on and so forth. So that's the thought from W. Gardner. And you can see different ways of looking at shared leadership. You have formal leadership, you have shared leadership. So in formal leadership type environment, you will have people, a particular set of leaders helping influence and motivate employees, versus shared leadership where you will have employees helping peers, helping influence peers, and so on and so forth. So formal leadership, you will have formal leaders making decisions. So decisions are more centrally located, and then employees, on the other hand, would be responsible for making decisions, certain decisions that could be decentralized in a shared leadership format. So those are the ways that we see it. So here we will talk about some real examples of shared leadership that we have, like in Rolls-Royce Engine Services, Oakland, California, that they talk about employees advocating for less micromanagement. When the employees had huddles with their management, they were able to ask questions and advocate for certain things that will enable them work well. And Rolls-Royce company said, well, that's true. If that's what you want, we are going to give you that ability to relate well with your clients. So when you build a product, you're also able to go to the client directly to seek feedback and get feedback and use that feedback to improve the experience of your client, of our client in this case. So it wasn't like a channel, going through a manager or a few people to say, well, we built the product, let these few people, regional manager, regional sales manager, go look for answers from the client. Same with Palo Verde Nuclear Power Station in California. They actually have an overarching leadership principle that says every employee is a leader regardless of title and position. And this is primary. This is just out and clear, outstanding, within this organization, because this is where most organizations should be. The ability to speak up and speak to the employees that they are all leaders. But I can bet you for sure that there's very few organizations today that employees understand their role as being part of, or the ability to act, live into the role of leadership. From anywhere, you can lead from anywhere. You don't have to be in a particular position. As a matter of fact, within a few 6 months or so, I had a software engineer tell me, well, I can never be a leader in this organization because I'm not a manager. Continuous commitment kicked in, and the software engineer was silent within the company. Within 6 months, they moved on to the next company. It's just because of the way managers communicate. So it's not inclusive, to let employees think that they are not leaders as well, whereas they are. So Palo Verde had, a leadership model that includes things like, well, let's think a lot about safety, operational focus, long-term productivity, cost effectiveness. But at the same time, we also want you to believe that, well, we are all leaders within this organization. So that said, Nelu, it's probably a good time to put in the other survey. As we get ready to recap.
Wonderful. So let me go ahead and share my screen once again. All right. So we have one more survey for you. We want to say thank you for you who are able to stay in the conversation we're having, like in this presentation. But we have one more. So we would love for you to help us with this conversation. And the question for you is, do I feel like I am a leader or not? So what do you think? So let me go ahead and share again the link to Pull Everywhere. One sec here. Okay. And let me know. Do I feel like I'm a leader or not? I do. Okay, we have Ada saying I do. Let me refresh my screen. I think it's not syncing properly. Feel like I'm a leader or not? There we go. Okay.
Thank you, Nelu. Thank you, everyone. I think I've seen a lot of good participation initially right now. I mean, the answer is obvious. Most people should feel like leaders. And if you haven't, really felt like you're a leader, then you probably have to ask yourself that question. Why am I not leading? Why am I not stepping into that position to lead today. Because within, like we have in the recap there, someone says, especially as a parent, well, yeah, that's true. You could equally lead in all aspects of life. Leadership is just something that is everywhere. It's, not just within organizations. We can just, for sure, encourage others as much as we can, because that's really what leadership is, to motivate people. Have the ability to motivate people, encourage others to motivate themselves, and so on and so forth. So that is about it. So let me see if I take that screen one more time and round it up for you.
Yes, especially as a parent, when asked the question, do I feel like I'm a leader or not? So it's the same.
Yeah. Yep. As a parent, it's always true. You can always be a leader. You can also allow your kids to lead. So shared leadership, like I said, is the auxiliary, to leadership. And auxiliary simply means it's like, you have auxiliary transmission in cars. There are some cars that have 4-wheel drive, but some don't really work as an auxiliary gear. So an auxiliary transmission will help you go through all sorts of terrain. That's how I explain it. The fact is that, well, some cars drive fast, but if you put them off-road, they can't perform. But if you have an auxiliary transmission, you probably perform anywhere. We might not go fast, but that is okay, because, slow is steady, steady is smooth, smooth is fast. That's what the SEAL say. So shared leadership complements shared values. So if we have that in place, we can also see that everyone desires the ability to contribute to societal good. And that's the overarching goal for most organizations. Most organizations realize that, well, in as much as we deliver products and services to people, the ultimate goal is to improve the quality of life in the world. So society will have to benefit from that. And the one way you can do that is not just based on profit, loss, accountability, and looking at all that stuff, but it's really about how you enable people. If you have 30,000 employees in the organization, how many of them are really contributing? How many of them are really benevolent? How many of them really understand the concepts of universalism, that they actually help improve the entire ecosystem, for everyone else? So that's about it. For me here, I think I didn't want to keep you too much. I would just say, may leadership be with you. And thanks you. Thank everyone. Thank Nelu. Thank Brooke. I see so many of my good friends here. Thanks for joining. And I have to apologize. We had a lot of technical hitches. As a matter of fact, it's almost surprising that we are able to pull this through today. We probably wouldn't have done this, but for the useful and thankful collaboration of everyone and assistance that we have within this group. But thanks for joining. Thank you.